The wind carried the smell of dry grass across the plains of Oklahoma, bending the yellow stalks in long, slow waves that moved like a quiet sea. The sky stretched wide and pale, and the afternoon sun leaned low, painting the fences with a faded gold. Along that lonely road, a small truck rumbled forward, its tires kicking dust into the air. Behind the wheel sat Dorothy, her hands steady but worn, the skin showing lines that spoke of years of work and prayers, whispered in silence. Everything she owned was packed in the back of that truck: a few boxes, a rocking chair, an old Bible, and the dream she had carried since the day her husband passed away. She had sold everything she had left in the small town of Silver Creek, the house where her children had grown up, the sewing machine that had seen countless nights of mending and waiting, and even the small garden she had loved. The money was just enough to buy a piece of land, a ranch left forgotten by time, far from everything and everyone. People in town said the place was too lonely, too ruined, and maybe even cursed. But Dorothy saw something different. She saw peace. She saw a place where she could start again, far from the noise of gossip and the pitying looks that always followed her since she became a widow. The sun was dipping when she reached the wooden gate. The sign that once carried a name was now faded and unreadable. The hinges groaned as she pushed it open and drove through. The dirt road wound between empty fields and silent fences until she finally saw it, the house. It was smaller than she imagined, but it stood proud, with a front porch that faced the open plains. The paint was gone, the windows dull, but it looked steady, as if it had been waiting for her. Dorothy parked the truck and sat for a moment, her eyes resting on the quiet house. There was something in the air, not fear, not sadness, but a stillness she could not quite explain. She turned off the engine, took a deep breath, and stepped out. The air was cool now, carrying the scent of earth and pine. Her boots pressed against the dry ground as she walked toward the porch. The wood creaked beneath her feet, and when she touched the doorknob it felt cold, as if no hand had touched it for years. Inside, the house was filled with dust and silence. A few old chairs, a table, a broken lamp. The floorboards moaned under her steps, and the air was heavy with time. She opened the windows to let the wind in, watching the curtains rise and fall like they were breathing again. In that simple act, something inside her softened. She whispered a small prayer of thanks, not because life had been kind, but because she was still standing. As night came, she lit a candle and unpacked her things. The sound of the wind moved through the cracks in the walls, gentle but constant. She sat by the window, watching the last light fade behind the hills. The ranch felt empty, yet not abandoned. It felt as if it was waiting to be lived in again. She told herself she had done the right thing. Selling everything was a risk, but she believed in starting over, in faith, in the idea that peace was worth any price. In the following days, Dorothy began to clean and repair the place. She swept the floors, fixed the doors, and patched the holes in the roof as best she could. She was not young anymore, but she worked with quiet determination. Every morning the sound of birds greeted her as she carried a bucket of water from the well behind the house. Every evening she watched the horizon turn red before disappearing into night. There was a strange kind of beauty in that silence. It was not the silence of loneliness, but the kind that teaches a person to listen to the wind, to the earth, to her own thoughts. Yet sometimes that same silence made her uneasy. There were moments when she felt she was not alone. She would catch the faint sound of footsteps on the porch or the creak of a floorboard upstairs when she was certain she had not been there. Once, she woke up in the middle of the night and thought she saw a light flicker through the cracks of the barn door. At first, she told herself it was just her imagination. Old houses made noises, and loneliness could play tricks on anyone's mind. But as days passed, those small signs began to grow. She found the door to the pantry open one morning when she was sure she had closed it. A glass she had left on the table was gone, and later found outside on the porch. And sometimes, when she returned from the fields, she could swear the smell of food lingered faintly in the kitchen, as if someone had been there while she was gone. Dorothy tried not to let fear take root. She was a woman of faith, and she believed that courage was not the absence of fear, but the strength to keep going despite it. Still, every creak of wood at night made her heart tighten just a little. She began locking the doors before sunset and keeping the small Bible by her bedside. She whispered prayers before sleep, asking for protection and light in whatever shadows might linger around her. One morning, while sweeping the porch, she noticed footprints near the barn. They were small and light, not like her own boots. She followed them cautiously, the broom still in her hand. The prints led to the back of the barn, where an old wooden door hung crooked on its hinges. The smell of hay and dust filled the air. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The barn was dim, with narrow beams of sunlight cutting through the gaps in the wood. Everything was quiet except for the faint rustle of straw. She looked around slowly, her eyes adjusting to the light. There were tools on the wall, a broken ladder, and an old horse blanket folded on a barrel. Nothing seemed unusual until she noticed a small movement near the corner. She froze. Something or someone was there. "Is anyone here?" she asked softly, her voice trembling just enough to reveal her nerves. No answer came, but she caught a glimpse of something, a shadow, small and quick, slipping behind a stack of hay. Dorothy's heart raced. She took a cautious step forward, the floor creaking beneath her. She bent down slightly, trying to see through the narrow space. For a moment, all she could hear was her own breathing. Then she saw it, the faint outline of a child's face, eyes wide and frightened. Dorothy's chest tightened. The child was thin, with tangled hair and clothes torn by wear. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the child bolted toward the back of the barn, disappearing through a small gap in the wall. Dorothy called out, but the sound of quick footsteps faded into the open field. She stood there for a long moment, trying to understand what she had just seen. Was it real? Could a child be living there, hiding on her land? That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring into the darkness that covered the fields. The image of those frightened eyes would not leave her mind. She wondered where the child had gone. Was there a family nearby? Had someone been living here before she arrived? The days that followed brought no answers, only more signs. She found crumbs near the barn door, a small piece of cloth caught on the fence, and once a half-eaten apple left on the porch. Whoever was hiding there was still around, still close. Dorothy's heart wrestled between fear and compassion. She could not bear the thought of a child alone in the cold nights. She remembered her own sons when they were small, the way they would run barefoot through the fields, laughing, hungry but full of life. One afternoon she left a plate of food near the barn, just bread, cheese, and an apple. She did not wait or look back. The next morning, it was gone. Something told her that this was not a ghost story or a trick of the mind. Someone lived there, someone who did not want to be seen. Dorothy decided she would find out who it was, but not with anger or fear. She believed that sometimes people hid because life had not given them any other choice. She remembered what her husband used to say: kindness was the strongest form of courage. The wind rose again that evening, carrying dust across the yard. The house stood quiet, and the horizon glowed faintly as the day ended. Dorothy sat on the porch, holding her old Bible on her lap. The fields stretched endlessly before her, and she wondered what kind of story this land still held. She had come here looking for peace, but maybe the ranch had brought her something else, a purpose she had not expected. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer for the hidden soul that shared her land. Whatever truth awaited her, she was ready to face it. The next morning, the air was cool and quiet, with a pale mist resting over the fields. Dorothy walked toward the barn, carrying a basket with more food. She moved slowly, not wanting to frighten whoever might be there. The old door creaked softly as she opened it. The same smell of hay and dust filled the air, but this time there was also something else, the faint scent of smoke, like someone had recently burned a small fire. She looked around carefully. A few pieces of dry wood were stacked in a corner, and near them, a tin can blackened by use. She could tell someone had been warming food there. She placed the basket on a bale of hay and whispered quietly, as if speaking to the wind. There's bread and fruit. You don't need to be afraid." Her words hung in the still air, unanswered. Dorothy stood for a moment, waiting, then turned to leave. But as she stepped outside, she noticed something small near the fence. A toy, half buried in the dirt. It was a wooden horse, simple and worn, the kind of toy a child might carve from scraps. She picked it up carefully, brushing away the dust. The small horse fit perfectly in her hand, its edges smooth from use. Whoever that child was, they had been here for a while. That afternoon, she decided to visit the nearest town to ask about the ranch's history. It was nearly 20 miles away, a quiet place with a few shops, a church, and a single gas station. The locals still called it Red Oak. She parked her truck near the general store and stepped inside. The bell over the door chimed softly. Behind the counter stood an older man with white hair and sharp eyes. "Morning, ma'am," he greeted. "You're new around here, aren't you?" Dorothy smiled politely. "Yes, I just bought the old Harris Ranch out on County Road 9. The man raised his brows slightly. "That place? Thought it'd stay empty forever. Didn't think anyone would want it after what happened there." Dorothy's hands tightened on the handle of her purse. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then leaned slightly forward. "The Harris family lived there years ago. Good folks. But during the drought, things went bad. The father left to find work out west and never came back. The mother got sick and the neighbor said the boy ran off into the woods one night. Nobody saw him again." Dorothy felt a chill despite the warmth of the store. "How old was the boy?" "About 10. Maybe 11. They searched for weeks, but the land out there swallows sound. After that, no one wanted the place. Folks said it was haunted, but I don't believe in that sort of talk. Probably just stories to explain sadness." She nodded slowly, thanked him, and left the store. The drive back felt longer than before. The road stretched endlessly, and the afternoon sun burned low on the horizon. As the ranch came into view, she could not stop thinking about the boy. Could it be possible that he had survived all these years? Or maybe another child had found shelter there, drawn by the same isolation she had once found comforting. When she arrived, the barn door was open again. Her heart raced as she approached. Inside, the basket she had left that morning was empty, but this time something was different. On top of the hay lay the small wooden horse she had found earlier, cleaned and placed neatly beside a folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The paper was old and yellowed, but the writing was careful, almost shy. "Thank you for the food. Please don't tell anyone I'm here." Dorothy felt tears blur her eyes. The note was written by a child's hand. She pressed it gently against her chest, feeling the weight of it. Whoever this child was, they trusted her just enough to leave a message. That trust meant something precious. That night, she lit a lantern and placed it by the window. It was her way of saying she wasn't afraid, that whoever was hiding could come closer if they wanted. She sat for hours listening to the wind, the steady hum of crickets, and the distant call of an owl. She wondered if the child was watching from the shadows, waiting for a sign that it was safe. The following morning, she found another note tucked under the porch mat. "I won't steal any more. I'm sorry." Dorothy smiled softly. It was not anger she felt, but compassion. She wrote a small reply on the back of the note. "You don't have to steal. There's enough food for both of us." She placed it back under the mat, hoping the message would be found. Days turned into weeks. Slowly, the fear in the air began to fade. The plates she left out were always returned clean. The footsteps she once feared became something familiar, and though she still hadn't seen the child again, she knew they were close, near enough to feel the warmth of kindness, but still hidden by the habit of fear. One evening, a storm rolled in from the west. The sky darkened quickly, and thunder echoed across the plains. Dorothy ran outside to secure the barn doors, the wind tearing at her hair. Rain began to fall in heavy sheets, blurring the world around her. As she reached the barn, she heard a faint cry inside. Without hesitation, she pushed open the door and called out, "It's all right, come out. You'll catch cold." From behind the haystack, a small figure emerged. The child stood there trembling, soaked and shivering. His clothes were torn, his face pale, but his eyes, those same frightened eyes, looked at her with a mix of fear and hope. Dorothy knelt slowly so she wouldn't scare him. "You don't need to run anymore," she said gently. "You're safe here." The boy hesitated, his lips trembling. "You won't send me away?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "No, I promise." He stepped forward, and Dorothy placed her shawl around his shoulders. His name, she learned that night, was Jacob. He had been living there for months, hiding after running away from a foster home in a nearby county. He said they treated him badly, that he had nowhere else to go. He had found the old ranch while searching for food and stayed because it felt quiet and safe. Dorothy listened without interrupting. Every word pulled at her heart. She had once prayed for company, for a reason to stay strong, and now it seemed that prayer had been answered in the most unexpected way. In the days that followed, Jacob began to trust her. He helped her with small chores, carrying firewood, feeding the chickens, and sweeping the porch. Dorothy cooked simple meals, and for the first time in a long while, the house felt alive. At night, she would read aloud from the Bible by the light of the lantern, and Jacob would listen quietly, his eyes heavy with sleep. The fear that had once filled the ranch was gone. In its place grew something steady and gentle, the kind of peace that comes from shared kindness. But not everyone in town would understand. Dorothy knew that if anyone discovered Jacob, they might take him away. She couldn't let that happen. The boy had found safety here, and she would protect that with all she had. One morning, while they were gathering eggs, a car appeared at the end of the road. It was rare to see visitors. Dust rose behind it as it stopped by the fence. Dorothy's heart tightened. Jacob froze beside her, eyes wide with panic. "It's all right," she whispered. "Stay inside." She walked toward the car as a man stepped out. He wore a suit and a badge clipped to his pocket. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm looking for a missing child. His name's Jacob Miller. Have you seen anyone around here?" Dorothy felt her pulse race. She kept her face calm. "No, officer. I live alone." He studied her for a moment, his eyes scanning the yard, the barn, and the house. "If you do see anything, please call the county office. We've been searching for months." She nodded, her voice steady. "I'll do that." He tipped his hat and got back into his car. The vehicle rolled away, leaving a trail of dust behind. Dorothy stood still until the sound faded into silence. Then she turned back toward the barn. Jacob peeked from behind the door, fear written across his face. "They're gone," she said softly. "You're safe now." That evening, the sunset stretched across the fields, warm and golden. Dorothy sat beside Jacob on the porch steps. He leaned his head against her arm, and she felt a quiet sense of gratitude she hadn't known in years. "Do you think God forgets people?" he asked suddenly. Dorothy looked at the horizon. "No," she said. "Sometimes we walk so far into the dark that it feels like he's gone, but he's still there waiting for us to come back." Jacob nodded slowly, his small hands clutching the edge of his blanket. The sound of the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying a peace that felt real. She didn't know what the future would bring, but she knew one thing: she would fight to give him the life he deserved, a life with safety, warmth, and hope. The night grew still around them, and the stars began to rise one by one. Where in the world are you watching from? Leave it down below in the comments. The days passed quietly after that night, as if the storm had carried away all the fear that once lingered on the land. Dorothy and Jacob settled into a rhythm that felt almost like family. Each morning, they worked side by side repairing fences, tending to the chickens, and cleaning the barn. The boy was quick to learn, eager to help, and though his laughter was still rare, it began to appear in small bursts that brightened the long days. Dorothy found herself watching him sometimes as he worked. There was a calmness about him, a strength she recognized from her own years of endurance. He had known hardship far too young, yet something in him refused to break. It reminded her of her own sons when they were small, how they had looked to her for safety when storms rolled through and thunder shook the windows. Those memories stirred something deep within her, not sadness, but a quiet kind of healing. In the evenings, they would sit by the window while she read from the old Bible. Jacob listened carefully, sometimes asking questions about the stories. He seemed fascinated by the idea of forgiveness and by how people could begin again after losing everything. Dorothy saw in those questions a reflection of his own fear, the fear that his past mistakes might define his life forever. "Do you think God still listens to someone like me?" he asked one night, his voice almost a whisper. Dorothy smiled gently. "I think God listens most to those who feel they have nothing left to say. Sometimes silence is the loudest prayer." Jacob nodded and stared at the small flame of the candle. The light flickered across his face, and for a moment Dorothy thought how strange and beautiful it was that two lost souls could find peace together in a forgotten house at the edge of the plains. But peace has a way way of drawing attention. A few days later, while Dorothy was mending a curtain on the porch, she noticed a car passing slowly along the distant road. It was the same dark sedan she had seen before, moving at a deliberate pace, stopping near the fence before turning around and driving away. Her heart sank. She knew that meant someone was still searching. That night she spoke to Jacob about it. "They might come again," she said softly. "If they do, you'll stay in the barn until I tell you it's safe." His eyes filled with worry. "Will they take me away?" Dorothy hesitated, her hands tightening around the fabric she was folding. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I won't let them hurt you, not while you're under this roof." He looked at her for a long time before saying, "You remind me of my mother." Those words pierced her heart in the gentlest way. She reached out and touched his shoulder. "And you remind me of the child I prayed I could help one day." After that conversation, a new sense of purpose filled the house. Dorothy made plans quietly, just in case. She gathered what little money she had left and began preparing a place where Jacob could stay hidden if things went wrong. Beneath the old floorboards in the pantry, there was a narrow space where she could store food, blankets, and a lantern. It was small, but safe. The following week she visited the pastor of the small church in Red Oak, a kind man named Pastor Lewis. He had known Dorothy for years before she moved away. When she told him about finding Jacob, she expected disapproval, maybe even fear, but the pastor listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. "You did what any good heart would do," he said finally, "but the law doesn't always understand compassion. If you want my advice, keep him close, keep him safe, and trust that truth has a way of revealing itself at the right time." Dorothy thanked him, tears filling her eyes. Before leaving, Pastor Lewis pressed a small envelope into her hand. Inside was money, not much, but enough to buy extra supplies. "For the boy," he said simply, "and for your courage." The next few weeks passed in a gentle routine. The fields began to change color as autumn arrived. The mornings were crisp, the air filled with the scent of burning wood. Dorothy and Jacob worked harder than ever, preparing for the cold months ahead. They fixed the roof, gathered firewood, and stored jars of food on the shelves. In those quiet days, Dorothy noticed how much Jacob had changed. His fear was fading. He smiled more, spoke more, and even began to hum when he worked. He had started carving small wooden figures again, animals, people, even a tiny horse like the one she had found that first day. He gave one to her and said, "This one's for you, so you won't forget me if you ever go away." Dorothy looked at the little figure and felt her eyes sting. "I'm not going anywhere," she said softly. "This is our home now." But peace, no matter how pure, rarely lasts unchallenged. One afternoon, while they were working near the fence line, they heard the distant sound of another car approaching. Dust rose in the distance, growing larger with every second. Dorothy's chest tightened. She told Jacob to run to the barn while she walked toward the road. The car stopped just beyond the gate. It wasn't the officer this time. It was a woman, young, well-dressed, her eyes sharp with curiosity. She stepped out and waved politely. "Hello there. Are you Mrs. Dorothy Collins?" "Yes," Dorothy answered, her tone cautious. "I'm Claire Miller," the woman said. "I'm Jacob's aunt." Dorothy's breath caught. The name was unmistakable. Claire continued, her voice softening. "We've been searching for him for months. He disappeared from the foster home, and we didn't know if he was alive. The sheriff told me you might have seen something out here." Dorothy stayed silent for a moment, studying her. Claire's eyes carried the same shade of blue as Jacob's, but behind them was exhaustion, not malice. Still, Dorothy couldn't trust easily. "I haven't seen anyone lately," she said finally. "It's quiet out here." Claire nodded, disappointment flickering across her face. "If you do, please tell him he's not in trouble. I just want him to come home. He's been through more than any child should." She reached into her pocket and handed Dorothy a small photograph. Jacob, smiling faintly in a school picture. "Please," she said again, "if you see him, tell him I'll be waiting." Dorothy watched as the woman returned to her car and drove away. She stood there long after the sound of the engine faded, the photograph still trembling in her hand. That night she showed it to Jacob. His reaction was immediate. "That's her," he whispered. "She's my aunt. She used to visit before they sent me away." Dorothy placed a hand on his shoulder. "She said she wants you home." Jacob shook his head. "Home isn't there anymore. She tried to help me, but her husband didn't want me around." "I don't want to go back." Dorothy felt the weight of his words. She understood the kind of pain that made a person afraid to return to where they once belonged. She had lived through her own version of that pain, when her husband died and the town pitied her instead of standing beside her. She knew that sometimes leaving was the only way to survive. As the nights grew colder, Dorothy faced a decision that kept her awake. She wanted to protect Jacob, but she also knew he could not hide forever. Secrets always found their way into the light. The question was whether that light would heal or destroy what they had built. One night, as wind howled outside, Dorothy prayed aloud by the window. "Lord, guide me to do what's right, even if my heart trembles." She turned and saw Jacob standing in the doorway, holding the small wooden horse. "Are you praying for me?" he asked. She nodded. "Always." He walked closer and handed her the toy. "Then I'll pray for you too." They stood together in the quiet glow of the lantern, two lives intertwined by loss, faith, and a shared hope that maybe, just maybe, they had both been led to this ranch for a reason. Outside, the land slept under a blanket of frost, unaware that in that small house, grace had quietly begun to grow. The cold season arrived with quiet authority. The wind no longer sang, it whispered. The ground had hardened under layers of frost, and each sunrise looked pale against the empty sky. Dorothy knew the rhythm of winters in the plains. They did not arrive all at once. They crept slowly into the corners of life, taking color from the fields and turning the breath of every morning into mist. Inside the ranch, the wood stove burned from dawn to night. The crackle of fire had become the sound of survival, and its warmth carried the promise of safety through the long, dark nights. Jacob had grown stronger. His face had lost the hollow look it once carried, and his steps were now full of energy. He woke early to bring in the wood. He helped mend fences before the frost took hold, and he learned to listen to the quiet the way Dorothy had learned long ago. When she watched him carry a bucket from the well with both hands, she felt something she had not felt in years. The comfort of knowing her work, her care, her faith had purpose again. The house was no longer a shelter for one heart. It had become a place of routine, laughter, and peace. The walls that once echoed loneliness now carried soft sounds of life. Dorothy would hum while cooking, and Jacob would trace letters on the fogged window while watching the wind play with the dry grass. There were no words needed between them most of the time. Their silence had its own meaning, the kind born of trust. Still, Dorothy's eyes never stopped watching the road that curved near the horizon. A part of her heart remained alert, aware that peace could vanish as quickly as it had arrived. She knew that kindness, once discovered by those who did not understand it, could become a threat. Each time a distant engine echoed in the valley, she paused whatever she was doing and listened. Most times it was only the passing of a mail truck or a farmer heading toward the next town, but some days the road carried strangers, and she watched from behind the curtain until the dust settled again. When the first snow began to fall, Jacob rushed outside to catch flakes in his hands. Dorothy watched him from the porch, his laughter rising above the soft sound of the wind. For a moment, the sight of him running freely filled her chest with warmth. The land around them, covered in white, looked like a promise renewed. She closed her eyes and thanked God for bringing him into her life. The days grew shorter. Mornings were blue and quiet, and evenings came before she was ready. They began to store food carefully, preparing for the long freeze. Each jar of preserved fruit, each bundle of firewood represented more than survival. It was a small act of hope. Dorothy knew that faith was not only spoken in prayer, but lived in the simple acts of every day. Jacob had started carving again. The sound of his small knife scraping wood became part of the rhythm of the house. He worked with focus, sitting near the stove, turning scraps of cedar into tiny figures of animals and people. One evening, he placed one of his carvings on the table beside her cup. It was a figure of a woman standing with her hands folded, her face turned slightly upward. Dorothy looked at it for a long time. She knew who it represented. She smiled softly and placed her hand over his. Neither spoke, but both understood. Outside, the snow deepened. The wind carried fine ice against the windows, and nights came with the steady sound of wood settling in the fire. But one night, a sound different from the rest stirred Dorothy from sleep. It was a dull knock against the window, followed by the crunch of footsteps on snow. She sat up quickly, her pulse rising. Jacob was asleep in the small room next to hers. She moved quietly through the house, every board underfoot groaning softly. Through the thin curtain, she saw the glow of headlights reflected on the snow. A vehicle had stopped by the gate. For a long moment, the light stayed still, then began to move closer. Dorothy whispered a short prayer under her breath and hurried to Jacob's room. She placed her hand on his shoulder and whispered for him to wake. He looked up in confusion, but when he saw the light outside, his face turned pale. She told him to go into the pantry and stay there until she called for him. He obeyed without question, his small figure vanishing behind the narrow wooden door. The knock at the front door came moments later, firm and clear. Dorothy steadied her breath and opened it halfway. The man standing outside wore a long, dark coat dusted with snow. His breath rose in small clouds as he spoke. He introduced himself as a deputy from the county. He said they were still searching for a missing boy. He asked whether she had noticed anyone unusual near her property. Dorothy's heart pounded, but her voice stayed calm. She told him she lived alone, that she rarely saw anyone beyond the occasional traveler passing by. The man's eyes scanned the interior of the house behind her. For a moment, Dorothy feared he would insist on coming inside. Instead, he tipped his hat politely and said that he admired her courage for living so far from town through the winter. When he turned to leave, the sound of his boots pressing into snow faded into the night like a warning carried by the cold. After he left, Dorothy stayed at the window until the glow of the headlights disappeared. Then she opened the pantry door, and Jacob stepped out with wide, frightened eyes. He did not need to ask what had happened. She simply told him it was over for now. He nodded, silent but trembling. She guided him back to bed, knowing neither of them would sleep again that night. The next morning, the world was covered in white silence. The air outside was so cold that each breath burned. Dorothy carried on with her work as usual, trying to hide her unease, but Jacob could see it in the way her hands lingered too long over the same task. He did not speak of it, but she knew he was thinking of what would happen if they returned. That evening, as the sky turned grey again, Jacob asked if she believed they would be found. Dorothy looked at the fire for a long time before answering. She told him that sometimes the world tried to separate people who belonged together, but faith had its own way of keeping them safe. She told him that no matter what happened, he had already been found in the only way that mattered. He had been found by grace. The following week brought another storm. Snow piled high against the doors, and the fence disappeared beneath it. The two of them spent their days inside, reading, carving, and keeping the fire alive. The world outside seemed to vanish, leaving only the sound of wind against the roof. In that stillness, Dorothy felt something shift inside her. She realized that what had begun as protection had become something deeper. The boy was no longer someone she was hiding. He was family. But one morning, while shoveling the path to the barn, Dorothy saw something that stopped her heart. Footprints. They were fresh and led straight to the barn door. The snow around them was disturbed, the marks heavy and deep, far larger than Jacob's. She followed them slowly, her pulse steady but high. Inside the barn, the air was cold and still. The footprints ended near the old hay pile, where she found something unexpected, a folded note pressed into the wood. Her fingers shook as she opened it. The handwriting was neat, unfamiliar, but deliberate. The message read that someone knew she was hiding the boy and that she should meet them at the old church before sunset if she wanted to keep him safe. She read the note twice before folding it carefully and tucking it inside her coat. Dorothy did not tell Jacob. She only said she needed to go into town for supplies. He offered to come, but she told him it would be safer if he stayed to keep the fire burning. The boy looked at her with concern, but he trusted her enough not to question further. She left after noon, the sky already turning a dull silver. The road stretched endless before her, quiet and untouched except for the thin trail of her truck. The old church stood at the edge of a small grove, its roof sagging under the weight of snow. Time had worn its walls, and vines had begun to climb through its broken windows. Dorothy stepped out of the truck, her boots sinking deep into the snow. The door creaked when she pushed it open, and the sound echoed through the hollow space inside. Light filtered through the cracks in the ceiling, and dust floated in the beams like frozen breath. A figure stepped out from the shadows near the altar. It was the old shopkeeper from Red Oak, Mr. Turner. He looked older than she remembered, his face marked by years and sorrow. He told her quietly that he had written the note. He explained that word had spread in town about her new life on the ranch, and that some people were beginning to suspect she was hiding someone. He told her he had come to warn her before the sheriff decided to return with others. Dorothy stood still, absorbing his words. Mr. Turner said he owed her family a debt, that years ago her late husband had saved his brother's life during a flood. He said he wanted to protect her the same way. He promised to speak with someone he knew at the county office who could delay the search. He urged her to keep Jacob hidden until spring, when the snow melted and the roads opened again. Dorothy thanked him with tears in her eyes. She told him that kindness still existed because men like him had not forgotten mercy. He nodded and placed a hand on her shoulder before she left. The wind was rising as she walked back to her truck, the first flakes of a new storm beginning to fall. The drive home felt longer than ever. By the time she reached the ranch, the sun had sunk behind the hills. The house stood quiet, its windows glowing faintly from the fire inside. She parked the truck, relief flooding through her. But when she stepped onto the porch, she noticed the door was slightly open. The snow around it was disturbed, and faint footprints led away into the dark. Inside, the house was empty. The stove still burned. The lamp still glowed, but Jacob was gone. On the table lay another note written in a trembling hand. It said not to look for him, that he did not want her to be in danger because of him. The words blurred through her tears as she sank into the chair, holding the paper tightly. The fire crackled softly beside her, throwing warm light across the empty room. Dorothy whispered his name again and again, her voice breaking through the silence. Outside, the snow fell steadily, erasing every footprint that might have shown where he went. She closed her eyes and prayed that wherever he had gone, God's hand would guide his steps. The storm lasted through the night, relentless and cold, wrapping the land in a silence so deep it swallowed every trace of sound. Dorothy barely slept. She sat near the window, her eyes searching the white horizon where the road disappeared. Every few minutes, she thought she heard movement outside, but it was only the wind pushing against the wooden walls. The chair beside the fire remained empty, and each time she looked at it, her chest tightened. Jacob's absence left a space larger than any room could hold. By morning, the world looked erased. Snow covered every footprint, every trail, every path that could have told her where he went. Dorothy put on her coat, pulled her shawl tight, and stepped outside. The cold bit at her cheeks, but she didn't stop. She called his name, her voice carried away by the wind. She checked the barn, the well, the fence line, and the small grove behind the house. Nothing, only silence, pure and heavy. She walked farther than she ever had before, her boots sinking into the snow until her legs trembled with exhaustion. She searched for hours, but the land gave her no answer. Finally, she returned home, her breath ragged, her hands raw from the cold. She sat by the fire, staring into the flames as if they could show her where to look. The note he had left lay folded beside her, its words burned into her mind. He had left because he thought he was protecting her. Dorothy whispered a prayer through the quiet. She asked for strength, for light, for the kind of faith that does not fade in the dark. She reminded herself that she had survived worse storms than this one. She had lost a husband, a home, and nearly her hope. Yet life had found her again in the form of a frightened child who needed love. That could not end this way. She would find him. 2 days later, the weather began to break. The sun appeared faintly through the clouds, turning the snow into a field of light. Dorothy packed a small basket of food and decided to drive into town. She needed help, and she knew there was only one person she could trust. Pastor Lewis had always been a man of faith and reason. When she reached the church in Red Oak, smoke rose from the chimney. The sound of an organ drifted softly through the air. She entered quietly, the warmth inside wrapping around her like a blanket. The pastor turned when he saw her and smiled gently, though concern quickly filled his eyes. He asked what had brought her through the snow, and Dorothy told him everything. The notes, the visit from the deputy, the warning at the old church, and finally Jacob's disappearance. Pastor Lewis listened in silence. When she finished, he placed a hand on her shoulder and told her that God's plans often look like storms before they clear into peace. He promised to ask around discreetly to see if anyone in town had seen a boy matching Jacob's description. He also told her that sometimes lost things find their way back when we least expect it, but that faith must be the bridge that keeps the heart steady until that moment comes. Dorothy left the church with a bit more strength than before. The road back to the ranch was long and empty. The light of the afternoon turned golden across the fields, and the snow glittered like glass. She reached home at dusk. As she stepped out of the truck, she noticed something near the porch, a small figure carved from wood. It was the little horse Jacob had once given her. It sat upright in the snow, facing the door, its shape clean and untouched. Her heart skipped. She looked around, but the land was quiet. She bent down and picked it up, feeling its smooth surface under her fingers. It was warm, as if it hadn't been there long. That night, she placed it on the table and sat beside it, whispering his name again. She felt he was near, somewhere close enough to know she was still waiting. The following morning, Dorothy went to the barn to gather wood. As she lifted a bundle of hay, she heard a faint rustle behind the stalls. Her breath caught. She turned slowly and saw movement in the shadows. At first she thought it was an animal, but then she saw a pair of small boots, half buried under a blanket. Her heart leapt. She knelt down and pulled the blanket gently aside. Jacob sat there, shivering, his face pale and tired. His eyes were wide, a mix of fear and relief. He had returned during the night. Dorothy didn't speak right away. She only reached out and placed her hand over his. For a long time they stayed like that, silent, the sound of the wind fading outside. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm. She told him that no matter what the world said, he belonged here. Jacob nodded slowly, his eyes filling with tears. He said he had tried to leave, that he thought people would come after her if he stayed, but when the night grew cold, and he remembered her prayer by the fire, he couldn't keep walking. He followed the road for a while, then turned back, guided only by the light from the ranch's chimney. Dorothy listened, her heart breaking and healing at the same time. She helped him to his feet and brought him inside. She made warm soup and wrapped him in a blanket by the fire. The house felt alive again. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the quiet rhythm of belonging. As the days passed, the snow began to melt. The sound of water dripping from the roof marked the slow arrival of spring. The fields, once buried in white, began to show traces of brown and green. Life was returning to the land, and with it came a sense of renewal. Dorothy knew that they could not hide forever, but she also knew that fear would not guide her decisions anymore. One afternoon, as she and Jacob walked along the fence, she told him that sometimes doing what was right meant facing what was hard. She said that they would go into town together soon to speak with Pastor Lewis and to tell the truth about what had happened. Jacob's face showed worry, but also a strange kind of peace. He said that if she was with him, he wasn't afraid. The day they drove to Red Oak was clear and bright. The sky stretched wide over the plains, and the air smelled of thawing earth. They parked in front of the church, and as they stepped out, people turned to look. Dorothy could feel their eyes, but she kept her head high. Jacob walked beside her, holding her hand. Pastor Lewis met them at the door, his eyes warm and understanding. Inside, they sat in his office, and Dorothy told the story from the beginning. The day she found the ranch, the noises in the barn, the boy who had appeared out of nowhere, and the months that followed. She spoke calmly, her words steady. Pastor Lewis listened without interruption. When she finished, he said that truth spoken with love had more power than any law, written without mercy. He promised to speak to the authorities on their behalf. He told them that he knew someone in the county who would understand the situation, someone who believed in second chances. Dorothy thanked him, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. Jacob sat quietly beside her, his hand still in hers, his eyes filled with trust. That evening they returned to the ranch. The light of the setting sun turned the fields gold. The house stood waiting, warm and familiar. Dorothy felt a peace she had not known in years. She realized that home was not a place one found by searching, but something that grew quietly wherever love decided to stay. Over the next few weeks, letters began to arrive from the county. One came from Claire Miller, Jacob's aunt. Her words were filled with gratitude. She wrote that she had spoken to Pastor Lewis and that arrangements were being made for her to visit the ranch. She said she wanted to thank Dorothy in person for taking care of the boy when the world had turned its back on him. When Claire arrived, the meeting was gentle and quiet. She stepped out of her car, carrying a small basket and a hesitant smile. Jacob watched from the porch, uncertain, until she called his name softly. He walked toward her, slowly at first, then faster, and when she knelt to embrace him, Dorothy felt her heart swell. There was no anger, no fear, only understanding. Claire stayed for hours. They sat together in the kitchen, drinking tea while Jacob played outside. She told Dorothy about the years after Jacob's parents had died, about the foster homes that had failed him, and about the guilt she carried for not doing more. Dorothy told her that guilt could bury a person if they let it, but forgiveness could free both the giver and the receiver. Claire nodded through tears, saying she believed that now. Before leaving, she asked Dorothy what she planned to do next. Dorothy looked out the window, watching Jacob chase the chickens across the yard. She said she planned to keep living the way she had been, one prayer at a time, one day at a time. She said she didn't know if Jacob would stay or go, but she trusted that whatever happened next would be guided by grace. After Claire's car disappeared down the road, Dorothy walked to the porch and sat with her hands folded in her lap. Jacob returned and sat beside her, tired but smiling. The sky above them was deep blue, the kind that carries peace after long storms. The field stretched wide and open, and for the first time in years, she felt no fear in the emptiness. She knew that life on the ranch would continue in quiet rhythms, planting, repairing, waiting, and hoping. But now, every sound in that house carried meaning. Every breath of wind through the trees reminded her that even in isolation, kindness could create family. Dorothy closed her eyes as the last light faded. The land that once seemed forgotten now held everything she needed: faith, redemption, and the miracle of one child's return. Spring settled over the plains like a long exhale after months of holding breath. The snow melted into the soil, feeding the grass that began to grow in soft shades of green. The air smelled of wet earth and promise. Birds returned to the fence posts, their songs breaking the silence that winter had left behind. For Dorothy, the change felt like a quiet blessing. The land had endured the cold, and so had she. Every morning, sunlight crept across the kitchen table, landing on the Bible that always lay open near her cup of tea. She would read a verse before beginning the day, her voice calm and steady. Jacob often listened without speaking, sitting near the window and whittling small pieces of wood. Sometimes he carved crosses, sometimes animals, sometimes simple shapes that looked like prayers turned into form. The rhythm of their mornings carried a peace that Dorothy had long thought she would never feel again. The visit from Claire had brought both relief and uncertainty. Though she had promised to return soon, weeks passed without another letter. Dorothy didn't hold it against her. She knew that healing took time and that family ties, once broken, required patience to mend. Still, she often looked toward the road, half expecting to see a car appear in the distance. Jacob didn't talk about it much, but Dorothy could tell that part of him feared the day someone might come to take him away. She did her best to remind him that love was not ownership. She told him that real family was not defined by blood alone, but by the hands that stayed when others left. Jacob listened with quiet eyes that carried both wisdom and longing. He was growing taller, stronger, but his heart was still tender. She could see it in the way he treated every small thing with care, the chickens he fed, the tools he cleaned, even the fragile seedlings they planted together in the small garden behind the house. As the weeks unfolded, life on the ranch found a rhythm of renewal. Dorothy repaired the fence posts that had rotted through the winter, while Jacob painted the porch railing a soft shade of white. The barn doors, once creaking and weather-worn, now stood sturdy again. The land was coming back to life, and with it, Dorothy felt herself doing the same. Sometimes at night, she sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, listening to the sounds of the open plains. The crickets hummed their endless song, and the distant hoot of an owl echoed through the trees. She often thought of her husband, of how much he had loved these same nights. She wondered if he would have approved of the choices she had made, of taking in a lost child, of defying the quiet rules of the world. Deep down, she believed he would have understood. He had always said that love was not meant to be hidden when the world turned cruel. One afternoon, as she was tending the small vegetable patch, she noticed Jacob walking along the fence line. He stopped every few steps, staring out toward the distant hills. Dorothy called to him gently, asking what he was looking for. He said he wasn't sure, only that he sometimes felt like someone was watching. She followed his gaze, but the land stretched empty and still. The wind moved across the fields in long, soft waves. That night, she thought about his words. The next morning, she found fresh boot prints near the gate, larger than Jacob's, unfamiliar. They led to the edge of the property and vanished into the brush. Dorothy's heart quickened. The memory of the deputy's visit returned to her mind, sharp and heavy. She did not tell Jacob what she had seen. She wanted to protect the calm they had built, but she also knew that secrets, once kept too long, could grow heavier than truth. 3 days later, she heard the sound of a car engine outside. She stepped to the porch and saw the same dark sedan that had once appeared months before. The sight made her chest tighten. Jacob came running from the barn, his hands covered in dust. Dorothy motioned for him to stay inside. A man stepped out of the car, older than the deputy she remembered, dressed in a grey suit with a county emblem pinned to his coat. His expression was not harsh but weary. He greeted her politely and said he was there on behalf of the Social Services Office. He explained that new arrangements were being made for Jacob, that a proper home had been approved. Dorothy listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked calmly what that meant. The man said that Claire Miller, Jacob's aunt, had filed for guardianship and that the process had been approved by the court. He assured Dorothy that her kindness and care had been noted, but the boy would have to move back to town within the month. He said that it was the law and that letters confirming the decision would arrive soon. Dorothy thanked him for coming. Her voice did not tremble, though her hands did. She watched as he drove away, the dust from his tires rising into the warm air. Jacob came out from behind the door and looked at her, waiting for an explanation. She told him what the man had said. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jacob shook his head and said he didn't want to go. Dorothy placed her hand on his shoulder and told him that life often asks us to walk paths we don't want to take, but that the road of truth always leads where love still waits. She told him that she believed God had not brought them together by accident. Maybe their time was not meant to last forever, but it had been meant to heal. Over the next weeks, she prepared him for the change. They packed his few belongings, his carvings, his clothes, and the wooden horse he had made for her. She told him he should keep it, but he refused. He said it belonged in the house that had given him a reason to believe in kindness again. She placed it on the shelf beside her Bible. Each morning she caught herself looking at it, the light from the window resting softly on its surface. As the day of departure grew near, Dorothy found herself praying more often. She prayed for strength, not to hold on, but to let go without bitterness. She prayed that Jacob would carry the lessons of this land with him, the patience of its fields, the faith that had grown between them. On the final morning, the air was clear and cool. A small truck came down the road, carrying Claire and the county worker. Dorothy waited on the porch, her hands folded together. When Jacob stepped out of the house with his small bag, Claire ran to him and embraced him tightly. Tears filled her eyes as she thanked Dorothy again and again for saving the boy's life. Dorothy smiled softly and said that she hadn't saved anyone. She had simply shared what she had been given. Jacob turned to her then, his eyes shining with the kind of gratitude that words could never hold. He said that he would visit as soon as he could. She nodded and told him that the door would always be open. She reminded him to walk with kindness and courage, even when the world felt cold. As the truck drove away, Dorothy stood watching until it vanished beyond the hill. The road stretched empty once more. The silence that returned was not the same as before. It was gentler, full of memory. She turned toward the house and felt the wind move against her coat. Inside, everything remained as it had been. The small table, the Bible, the wooden horse, the chair by the fire. She sat down and let the stillness wrap around her. Days turned into weeks again. The house felt larger now, quieter, but not lonely. Dorothy filled her time with work. She planted flowers near the porch, repaired the roof, and kept the fields clean. Each task carried purpose. Each sound of the wind through the trees reminded her that love does not end when presence fades. It continues in every breath, in every memory that refuses to die. One evening, as the sun set over the plains, Dorothy heard footsteps on the porch. She opened the door and found a letter placed neatly on the step. It had no name on the front, but she recognized the handwriting immediately. Inside was a short note written in Jacob's hand. He said that he was safe, that his aunt was kind, and that he missed the sound of the wind on the ranch. He wrote that he was learning to build wooden toys at school, and that he had told his new friends about the woman who taught him that kindness was stronger than fear. Dorothy read the letter twice before placing it in the Bible, marking the page that spoke of love that endures all things. She sat by the window, looking out at the vast open land. The evening light filled the room, turning the air golden. She thought about how strange and beautiful life could be, how it could take everything from a person only to return something unexpected, something pure. She whispered a prayer of thanks, not just for the child who had crossed her path, but for the chance to feel useful again, to be part of something bigger than loneliness. She realized that faith was not about understanding every plan. It was about walking forward even when the horizon remained uncertain. That night, as she prepared for bed, she stopped by the shelf where the small wooden horse stood. The light from the lamp touched its surface, and for a moment it seemed to glow. She smiled and whispered that wherever Jacob was, he would always have a home here. The wind moved softly through the cracks in the window, carrying the sound of peace across the room. The ranch slept quietly under the wide sky, the stars above spreading their silent light. The land that once felt forgotten now held the story of two souls who had found each other against all odds. In the stillness, Dorothy understood what true redemption meant. It was not a grand event or a sudden miracle. It was the slow, patient work of love, restoring what pain had taken away. Summer arrived quietly, bringing with it the long golden days that stretched across the Oklahoma plains like endless ribbons of light. The air was warm and still, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers that had begun to bloom along the edges of the road. The fields surrounding the ranch moved gently under the wind, their rhythm steady and patient, like the breathing of the earth itself. For Dorothy, the land had become both her prayer and her answer. It had been 3 months since Jacob left. The ache of his absence had softened, not because she had forgotten him, but because the love that had once felt heavy now rested gently in her chest. She carried him in the rhythm of her days, in the way she stirred the fire every morning, in the way she walked to the fence line and looked toward the horizon before sunset. Some evenings, she would hear the faint echo of a boy's laughter carried through memory, and it made her smile rather than cry. She kept his letter folded inside her Bible, near the passage about those who plant in tears, reaping with joy. Each time she opened the book, she touched the paper softly, as if greeting an old friend. She had come to believe that their meeting had been no accident. It had been a divine crossing, a moment arranged by grace to remind her that love did not depend on time or distance. Life on the ranch continued in quiet rhythm. Dorothy tended the garden, repaired fences, and watched the slow dance of the seasons. The chickens clucked lazily near the barn, the horses grazed along the fence, and the wide open land once again carried the sound of peace. On Sundays, she drove into town to attend church. Pastor Lewis always greeted her with a knowing smile. Sometimes he mentioned that Jacob's aunt wrote to him, saying the boy was doing well, studying hard, and asking when he could visit the ranch again. Dorothy never pressed for details. She trusted that when the time was right, the road would bring him back. The townspeople had grown used to seeing her again. Some still whispered about her decision to live alone so far from everyone else, but most simply smiled and tipped their hats as she passed. Dorothy had never cared much for opinions. She had learned long ago that faith meant standing steady, even when others didn't understand your steps. One afternoon, as she returned from town, she stopped her truck on the side of the road to pick wildflowers. The sky was a deep blue, and the sound of crickets filled the air. As she knelt to gather the blossoms, she noticed something unusual near the ditch, a small wooden carving half buried in the dirt. When she picked it up, her heart skipped. It was one of Jacob's figures, shaped like a dove, the same kind he used to carve while sitting by the stove. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the familiar marks of his knife. It had been painted faintly in white, the paint faded by weather. She smiled through tears she hadn't expected. Whether it had fallen from a wagon or been left there by him on purpose, she took it as a message. Some love finds a way to leave signs in the simplest places. That evening, she placed the small dove beside the wooden horse on the shelf. The two carvings stood together under the golden light that entered through the window. For Dorothy, they were reminders of the seasons of her life: loss, discovery, love, and faith. Each piece told a story that no one else would ever fully understand, but that she carried deeply in her soul. As summer deepened, the heat became heavy, and the air thick with the scent of hay. The fields shimmered under the sun, and the rhythm of work slowed. Dorothy began rising earlier, finishing her chores before the day grew too warm. She often sat on the porch in the afternoons, a glass of lemonade beside her, the sound of cicadas filling the quiet. Sometimes she would think of her husband and of the years they had built together before the silence came. She realized that grief had changed shape over time. It was no longer sharp or consuming. It had become part of her strength. One morning, as she watered the garden, she saw dust rising on the road in the distance. It wasn't the mail truck. The cloud moved slowly, deliberate, like a visitor with purpose. She wiped her hands on her apron and stood still, shading her eyes from the sun. As the vehicle came closer, she saw it was a familiar small truck. When it stopped by the gate, her heart began to beat faster. The door opened, and a tall young figure stepped out. Jacob was older now, a few inches taller, his hair shorter, his shoulders stronger. He looked toward her with the same calm eyes she remembered, though now they held a light of confidence that came only with time. Dorothy stood frozen for a moment, afraid that if she moved, the image would vanish. But then he smiled, that same quiet, gentle smile that had once filled her lonely house with warmth. She walked toward him slowly, the dry grass brushing against her dress. When she reached him, neither spoke right away. The years of separation had not erased the bond between them. They simply looked at each other, both knowing that words could not capture what time had already said. Finally, Jacob spoke. He said that he had finished school and that he was working part-time with his uncle in Red Oak. He told her that he had come to see the ranch, to see if it still looked the same. Dorothy said softly that the ranch hadn't changed much, but that the land seemed brighter now that it had reason to smile again. They spent the rest of the afternoon walking through the fields. Jacob told her stories about school, about the small workshop where he helped build toys for children. He said he had learned to carve larger pieces and that people sometimes bought his work at the market. Dorothy listened with quiet pride. Every word was proof that the boy she had once found trembling in a barn had grown into someone steady and kind. When the sun began to lower, they sat on the porch, watching the light fall across the open land. Jacob turned to her and said that he often thought about the nights they spent reading by the fire, about how her prayers had made him believe in hope again. He said he had come to thank her, but also to tell her something more. He said he wanted to keep the ranch alive. He wanted to work the land during the summers and learn how to grow crops, maybe even rebuild the barn properly one day. Dorothy felt her throat tighten. She told him that the ranch had been waiting for him all along. She said that maybe it had never been hers alone, but something meant to be shared. The next morning, Jacob helped her repair the old gate. His movements were confident, and his laughter returned to the air like an old song. The chickens followed him around the yard, and the dog barked with excitement. Dorothy watched from the porch, her heart full. She realized that time had not taken anything from her. It had only given her back what she was ready to receive. The days that followed were filled with work and joy. Jacob stayed for the rest of the summer, and together they brought life back to every corner of the ranch. They repainted the porch, fixed the roof, and cleared the old field behind the barn for planting. At night, they sat outside under the stars, talking about dreams and plans for the future. Dorothy spoke of the past sometimes, not with sadness, but with gratitude. One evening, as the sun disappeared behind the hills, Jacob said that he finally understood why she had sold everything to buy this place. He said that the ranch was not just land or house, it was faith made visible, a place where broken things came to heal. Dorothy smiled and told him that she had not bought a ranch. She had bought a chance to begin again. The summer faded slowly into the gentle coolness of autumn. The fields turned golden once more, the air crisp and clear. When Jacob prepared to leave, Dorothy felt the same quiet ache she had known before, but this time it carried peace instead of fear. She knew he would return again, because this place was part of him now. Before he left, he gave her one more carving, a small tree with two branches growing from the same trunk. He told her it was the story of them, rooted in the same soil, even when life carried them to different places. She placed it beside the dove and the horse on the shelf, the light from the window wrapping all three in gold. That night, after the sound of his truck faded down the road, Dorothy stood at the door and looked out across the plains. The stars stretched endless above her, calm and bright. The wind moved softly through the fields, carrying the scent of rain. She whispered a prayer of thanks for every chapter that had led her here, for the pain that had carved strength, for the faith that had guided her steps, and for the love that had returned, not as need, but as peace. The house stood still behind her, filled with warmth and memory. The land before her seemed to breathe. In that quiet moment, Dorothy understood that home was not where life began or ended. It was where grace decided to stay. Autumn deepened slowly across the plains. The air turned cool and clean, carrying the scent of dry leaves and soil. The light in the evenings became softer, spreading gold over the fields like a blessing that lingered before fading into dusk. Dorothy watched the seasons change from the porch each morning and night, always with the same quiet gratitude. The ranch, once silent and forgotten, had become alive again. The wooden fences stood straight, the garden yielded pumpkins and beans, and the barn no longer groaned under its own weight. The land looked cared for, and in every part of it there was a trace of Jacob's hands. He wrote to her often. His letters came every 2 weeks, each one written neatly, each one filled with small stories about his days. He told her about the woodshop he worked in, about the children who laughed when he showed them how to carve their first toys, about how he always tried to carve one figure for the ranch before sending his letters. Each envelope contained something new, a small carving of a bird, a flower, a simple heart. Dorothy kept them all in a small box beside her Bible, treasures shaped by memory. Each time she opened one of his letters, she felt the same calm rise through her. It reminded her that some prayers take time to find their answers, and that God's timing never rushed nor delayed. The distance between them no longer felt like loss. It felt like part of a larger story, one that continued even when pages turned. The days grew shorter as November approached. The air smelled of wood smoke, and the sound of migrating birds filled the sky. Dorothy began preparing the ranch for winter again, storing firewood and repairing the shutters before the cold returned. She was slower now, her steps careful but steady. Time had marked her body, but her spirit carried a strength that came only from years of enduring with purpose. One afternoon, while collecting apples from the small tree behind the house, she noticed a truck approaching on the distant road. Her first thought was that it might be a delivery from town. But as the vehicle came closer, she recognized it. Jacob's truck. Her heart leapt. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the gate, the wind lifting her hair as she went. Jacob stepped out with a smile, carrying a bundle wrapped in brown paper. He said he had finished his work earlier than expected and wanted to spend a few days at the ranch before the winter began. Dorothy welcomed him with open arms, her eyes glistening with joy. The moment felt like sunlight breaking through after long clouds. They spent that evening by the fire, talking and laughing like no time had passed at all. Jacob told her about the people he worked with, about how the man who owned the shop had begun teaching him more about business, about how he dreamed of one day opening his own workshop near the town square. Dorothy listened, her heart full of pride. She told him that dreams built on kindness and patience were the only ones that lasted. The next morning they walked through the fields together. The ground was covered with a soft layer of frost that sparkled in the sunlight. Jacob said that he missed the way the land looked at this time of year. Dorothy smiled and told him that the land had missed him too. They stood in silence for a long while, watching the horizon stretch endless and calm. Jacob helped her with chores that day, carrying wood, fixing hinges, and cleaning the old barn again. Inside, the smell of hay mixed with dust and the faint memory of all that had happened there years before. Dorothy could still picture the frightened boy who had once hidden in that corner. Now that boy stood tall, strong, and sure of himself. The contrast filled her with quiet wonder. As the sun began to set, they sat together on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the sky turn shades of red and gold. Jacob spoke about wanting to help her repair the well next spring, maybe even rebuild the old chicken coop. He said he wanted to make sure the ranch stayed strong for years to come. Dorothy told him that the ranch had already become what it was meant to be, not just a piece of land, but a place of grace, a sanctuary where broken things had found a reason to grow again. That night, while Jacob slept in the small room that had once been his, Dorothy stayed awake a little longer. She sat by the window, looking out at the fields bathed in moonlight. The wind moved softly through the grass, whispering against the house like a lullaby. She thought about how far they both had come. She had once believed her life would end in silence, that her final years would be spent in solitude, but life, in its quiet mercy, had rewritten her story. She had learned that beginnings often hide inside endings, waiting for the right moment to bloom. The next morning, the air was colder. A faint mist hovered over the ground, turning the landscape silver. Dorothy made breakfast, while Jacob went outside to fetch water from the well. When he returned, his expression was thoughtful. He said that as he walked across the field, he kept thinking about what the ranch had given him. He said it had taught him that peace was something you built, not something you waited for. Dorothy looked at him and said that she had learned the same. Later that afternoon, they went into town together. Dorothy wanted to buy a few supplies before the next frost. People in Red Oak greeted them kindly. Many of them still remembered the story of the widow who had bought the old ranch and the boy she had once taken in. They smiled, spoke softly, and treated them with respect. Pastor Lewis saw them as they passed the church and called out a blessing, his voice warm and proud. They returned home as the sun dipped low. The drive back was quiet, the kind of silence that speaks of comfort rather than distance. When they reached the ranch, Jacob unloaded the supplies and then handed Dorothy the brown bundle he had brought when he arrived. He told her to open it. Inside, wrapped carefully in paper, was a small wooden plaque. On it, carved with delicate precision, were the words, "Grace Hill Ranch." Dorothy traced the letters with her fingers, her eyes misting. Jacob said that he thought the name suited the place, a name that carried both history and hope. She nodded slowly, her heart full. They nailed the plaque to the front gate together, and when they stepped back to look at it, Dorothy felt tears slip down her cheeks. The ranch finally had a name, one that told its story without words. That night, the two of them sat by the fire again. Jacob read aloud one of the letters he had written but never sent, a letter he said was meant for her but had remained in his pocket since the day he left. In it, he had written about how the ranch had changed him, how he had learned from her that love was not a feeling, but a choice, repeated every day, even when no one was watching. He said he had learned that family could begin anywhere two people decided to care more about each other than about themselves. Dorothy listened quietly, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. She realized that she had received more from Jacob than she had ever given. Through him, she had learned that even after loss, the heart could grow new roots. She thanked him for reading it, and he smiled, saying the letter finally belonged where it was meant to be. When morning came, frost covered the ground again. Jacob said he needed to return to town to prepare for work, but promised he would be back soon. Before he left, Dorothy packed him a basket with bread, apples, and a jar of jam. She stood by the gate as his truck rolled down the road, the sign Grace Hill Ranch standing proudly behind her. The sound of the engine faded into the distance, leaving only the wind and the quiet hum of the plains. Dorothy turned back toward the house. The fields glowed under the pale light of early winter, and the air smelled of change. She felt no sadness this time, only peace. The ranch had found its story, and so had she. That evening, as she sat by the fire reading Jacob's old letters, she thought about how strange life could be, how pain could turn into strength, how loneliness could open the door to love, and how one small act of kindness could ripple across years, changing lives forever. When she finally went to bed, she whispered her usual prayer of gratitude. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, soft and steady, as if the land itself was breathing alongside her. In the stillness of that night, Dorothy knew that grace was not something you found. It was something you lived, one quiet day at a time. Winter returned to the plains with its quiet strength, sweeping over the fields like a white tide. The air grew sharp again, and frost covered the windows each morning before Dorothy could light the fire. The ranch stood firm beneath a sky of pale gray, its wooden walls holding warmth and memory. It was the third winter since Jacob had come into her life, and though he no longer lived there, his presence filled every corner of the house. The sign at the gate, Grace Hill Ranch, had weathered its first storms and still shone proudly. The letters Jacob had carved were slightly worn now, but the name remained as strong as the day they had nailed it there together. To Dorothy, it was more than a name. It was a testimony, a quiet reminder that miracles rarely arrived in flashes of light. Most came slowly, hidden in small moments of faith and choice. She rose each morning before dawn, her routine steady and peaceful. The sound of the kettle on the stove, the creak of the rocking chair, and the soft glow of the lantern had become part of the rhythm of her days. The chickens clucked in the yard, the wind moved through the dry grass, and every breath of cold air reminded her that she was still being given another day to live with purpose. Jacob continued to write. His letters came with news of his growing workshop. He said he was teaching children to carve now, just as Dorothy had taught him to believe in himself. Each letter carried a small gift inside, a wooden keychain, a cross, or a tiny piece of art that told a story in its simplicity. Dorothy placed each one carefully on a shelf beside the old carvings, her collection growing into a small museum of memory. She would sometimes look at them and think that faith itself was like carving wood. It required patience, small, steady cuts, and trust in the shape that would one day appear. The quiet of winter no longer felt lonely. It felt sacred. The world slowed, and with that stillness came reflection. Dorothy often found herself sitting by the window, remembering the seasons that had passed since she had first stepped through the gate of the old ranch with a truck full of boxes and a heart full of doubt. She had come seeking peace and had found a purpose far greater than she imagined. One morning, as she was sweeping snow off the porch, she saw a figure approaching along the road. The sky was bright with sunlight reflecting off the white ground, and for a moment she had to shield her eyes. When the figure came closer, she realized it was a woman. She recognized the posture before she recognized the face. It was Claire, Jacob's aunt. Dorothy walked down the path to greet her. Claire smiled, her cheeks red from the cold, and said that she had come to visit before Christmas. She said Jacob was busy preparing gifts for the children at the workshop and would come after the new year. Dorothy welcomed her inside, and they shared tea while the fire warmed the room. Claire spoke softly, her tone full of gratitude. She said she had never truly understood what Dorothy had done for Jacob until he began telling his story to others, not with sorrow, but with pride. She said he always spoke of the ranch as the place where he learned to trust life again. She told Dorothy that his kindness had changed her too. It had made her realize that love did not belong only to the strong or the lucky. It belonged to those who chose to give it, even after loss. Dorothy listened quietly, her eyes glistening. She said that she hadn't saved Jacob. He had saved her. She told Claire that faith had brought them together for reasons that neither of them could have planned. Claire nodded, understanding completely. For a long time they sat in comfortable silence, the kind that needed no words. That evening, after Claire had gone, Dorothy stepped outside. The sky was painted with the colors of twilight, soft blues and pinks melting into the horizon. The snow glowed faintly under the fading light. She stood there for a long time, breathing the cold air, feeling both small and infinite. The land stretched in every direction, quiet and still, and she thought about how much it had given her, not wealth, not luxury, but something greater, peace that did not depend on circumstance. She thought of her husband again, and how his hands had once worked the soil, just as Jacob's now did. She remembered his laughter, and the way he used to say that faith was like planting a seed. You never knew when it would bloom, only that it would. She smiled softly at the thought, whispering that he had been right all along. As the days passed, Christmas drew near. The town of Red Oak prepared for the holiday with lights and music. Dorothy went into town to attend the service at the church. The building was warm with candlelight, and the air was filled with the scent of pine and wax. Pastor Lewis spoke about second chances, about how every act of kindness was like lighting a candle in a dark room. Dorothy felt the truth of his words deep within her. When the congregation sang Silent Night, her voice joined quietly among the others. The melody carried through the old walls and out into the night, rising into the cold air like a prayer. After the service, several townspeople came to greet her. They spoke kindly, asking about the ranch, about Jacob, and about her plans for the new year. Dorothy answered each question with grace. She told them that life was peaceful, that the land was steady, and that she had more to be thankful for than she could ever count. On the drive home, the stars shone clear and bright over the open plains. The road stretched endless before her, and the world felt both vast and close. When she reached the ranch, she stopped at the gate and looked at the sign one more time. The moonlight touched the carved letters, and for a moment they seemed to glow. Grace Hill Ranch. The name had never felt more true. That night, she sat by the fire reading Jacob's latest letter. In it, he wrote that he had been working on a special carving for her, one that would take time to finish. He said he wanted it to be something that reminded her of everything they had built together. He ended the letter with words that made her eyes fill with tears. Every time I carve, I remember the sound of your prayers by the fire. You taught me that love never leaves. It simply changes shape. Dorothy folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the others. She whispered a thank you to the quiet room and let the peace of the moment wash over her. When morning came, the land lay still beneath a pale sun. The frost sparkled on the fences, and the trees stood tall against the blue sky. Dorothy stepped outside with her cup of tea, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. The silence was complete, but it was the kind of silence that held life within it, the sound of things growing quietly, unseen. She looked across the fields, remembering every season that had passed, every trial that had tested her faith, every joy that had reminded her of grace. She knew the years ahead would continue to bring both hardship and beauty, as they always had, but she no longer feared either. She had learned that peace was not the absence of pain, it was the strength to stand through it, knowing that love endures. The wind moved softly through the grass, and Dorothy smiled. She turned toward the house, its windows glowing with morning light, and whispered her daily prayer, a prayer not of asking, but of thanks. The land stretched endless before her, silent and steady, holding every memory, every act of kindness, and every whisper of faith. The ranch was alive, not because of what it owned, but because of the love that had been planted there. Dorothy stepped back inside, closing the door gently behind her. The sound of the fire greeted her once more, steady and warm, just as it had from the beginning. The first dawn of the new year broke across the plains with a pale light that touched the land gently, like a promise whispered rather than spoken. Frost sparkled across the grass, and a thin mist rose from the ground, curling upward into the cold air. Inside the ranch, Dorothy stirred awake before the sun, as she always did. The rhythm of her mornings had not changed. The soft crack of kindling, the steady glow of fire, the faint aroma of coffee filling the small kitchen. Yet something about that morning felt different. It carried the quiet certainty that a new season of her life was waiting to begin. The house was still but not empty. Every wall carried echoes of laughter and faith, of moments that had reshaped her understanding of what family truly meant. The wooden horse still stood on the shelf, beside the dove and the small tree Jacob had carved. The light from the window touched them one by one, making their surfaces gleam softly. They seemed to hold their own quiet conversation, the kind that only time could hear. Dorothy sat by the table and opened the latest letter from Jacob. He had written it just before Christmas, but had asked Claire to deliver it with her visit. His handwriting had matured, the lines more confident, the words flowing easily. In the letter, he spoke of his plans to open a workshop of his own, one where he could teach children not only to carve wood, but also to create with patience and heart. He said he wanted to call it the Grace Workshop in honor of the ranch. He ended the letter by saying that everything he had learned about kindness, courage, and forgiveness had begun within those old walls, under her care. Dorothy folded the letter slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper as if she could touch the moment it described. Tears filled her eyes, not of sadness, but of deep, quiet joy. She whispered a thank you to the silence and looked out through the window at the land bathed in morning light. The day passed gently. The sound of the wind through the dry branches felt softer now, like a song that had learned to rest. Dorothy spent the afternoon walking through the fields, checking the fence posts and collecting fallen branches from the grove. She moved slower these days, but her steps were steady, her spirit unbroken. Each footstep pressed lightly into the soil that had seen her sorrow, her faith, and her redemption. As she walked back toward the house, she stopped by the gate and looked up at the sign that bore the name of the ranch. The letters carved by Jacob's hands caught the light of the low sun. She smiled, remembering the day they had placed it there, and how she had realized that faith could live in wood, in land, in love, and in memory. That evening, as dusk settled and the fire began to crackle, Dorothy sat in her chair by the window, her Bible open on her lap. She read the passage she had read many times before, about how love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. She thought about how her life had proven those words true. Each hardship she had faced had been a test, and each act of kindness had been a response to that test. She had once thought that her story had ended the day she lost everything, but she now understood that loss was only the soil where new beginnings take root. The winter stretched long but kind. There were days of heavy snow and nights when the cold pressed hard against the windows, yet the ranch remained warm. Neighbors began to visit more often, bringing bread, milk, and conversation. They admired how well she kept the place, and often said that her land seemed blessed. Dorothy would smile and answer that blessings were not measured in comfort, but in the strength to remain faithful when comfort was gone. One Sunday, as she sat in the pew at the church, Pastor Lewis asked if she would share her story during the next service. He said that many in town had heard whispers about the widow who once took in a boy with nowhere to go, and how that act of kindness had changed 2 lives. Dorothy hesitated at first. She had never seen herself as someone whose story could teach others, but as she prayed that night, she felt a quiet conviction that perhaps her words might reach someone who needed hope. The following week, she stood at the front of the small church, her hands folded calmly. The faces before her were familiar: farmers, families, children, all watching her with gentle expectation. She began to speak softly, telling them about the years when she had lived in silence, about how faith had led her to the ranch, and about the boy who had brought her life back into motion. She told them that grace had not arrived with noise or miracle, but with the sound of small footsteps in a barn. As she spoke, the church was silent. Not one person shifted or coughed. Every heart in that room seemed to listen, not with ears, but with spirit. When she finished, she said that forgiveness was not a feeling but a choice, that love was not fragile but enduring, and that faith was not built in grand moments but in the quiet persistence of doing good when no one sees. When she stepped down, Pastor Lewis thanked her with tears in his eyes. Many others came to her afterward, some hugging her, others simply holding her hand in silence. That night, as she sat by the fire, she realized that telling her story had brought her peace she hadn't known she still needed. For the first time in years, her heart felt entirely light. Spring came again. The air grew warmer, and the fields began to stir with color. Dorothy spent her mornings planting new seeds in the small garden. She worked with slow care, her hands steady in the soil. She knew that life would always continue, one cycle after another, as long as love and labor met in the same place. One afternoon, she received another letter from Jacob. This one was shorter than usual, but full of excitement. He wrote that the workshop was open now, that children came from nearby towns to learn how to carve, and that the first piece they had sold together was a replica of the sign that stood at her gate. He said he had named it the Grace Collection, and that every item they made carried a small engraving of a tree, two branches growing from the same trunk. He said he wanted her to know that no matter how far life carried him, he would always be rooted where kindness began. Dorothy pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes. She imagined the small shop full of laughter, the smell of wood and varnish, the sound of Jacob's calm voice guiding each hand. She pictured his smile, and her heart filled with the certainty that everything she had lived for, every sorrow, every prayer, every act of faith, had led to this. The months that followed were peaceful. The ranch thrived quietly. The fields bloomed again, and the house stood strong under the wide sky. Dorothy grew older, her steps slower, but her eyes brighter. She often spent her evenings outside, watching the sunset paint the horizon in colors that reminded her of every season she had survived. She no longer feared time. She had learned that aging was not a loss of days, but a gathering of grace. One evening, as she sat on the porch wrapped in her shawl, she saw the familiar shape of Jacob's truck driving up the road once more. When he stepped out, taller and older, she could see the man he had become. He carried something wrapped in cloth. It was the carving he had promised, a detailed piece of art that captured the ranch in perfect miniature. Every detail was there: the porch, the sign, the fields, even the two chairs by the window. At the base, he had carved the words, "Grace endures." Dorothy held the carving in her hands, her eyes glistening with tears. She said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The moment spoke for itself, the past and the present woven together in one act of love. That night, they sat by the fire again, just as they had years before. The wind moved softly outside, and the house was warm with light. Dorothy looked around the room, the shelves, the letters, the carvings, the simple signs of a life lived fully, and she smiled. She realized that she had been part of something lasting, something that would remain even when she was gone. The fire burned steady, its glow casting gentle shadows across the walls. In that light, the figures on the shelf, the horse, the dove, the tree, and the small carving of the ranch all seemed to shimmer. The house, the land, the love, and the faith that had built them were one and the same. Outside, the stars stretched wide across the sky, silent witnesses to every season that had passed. Dorothy leaned back in her chair, her heart full, her spirit still. Morning light returned slowly over the plains, spreading calm across the quiet land. The days had grown longer again, and soft green began to reappear between the rows of dry grass. The air was cool, and every sound carried easily. The whistle of the wind through the fence, the call of distant birds, the faint creak of the porch. Dorothy awoke to that familiar music, the same rhythm that had marked every chapter of her life since coming to the ranch. The years had left gentle marks on her face, but her eyes remained steady and bright. Each line was a story, each moment a trace of endurance and grace. She rose from her chair and opened the window. The smell of the earth drifted inside, fresh and alive. She smiled, knowing that peace was not something promised for tomorrow. It was something quietly present in the moments that were still given. On the table rested the carving Jacob had brought her, the small wooden ranch with its fields and porch, perfectly shaped by his hands. Dorothy often looked at it as though it were a mirror of her soul, a reminder of everything life had built and rebuilt inside her. The details were delicate, carved with patience and love. Each curve of the roof, each fence post, each tree spoke of time, memory, and purpose. It wasn't just a carving, it was a testimony of two lives that had crossed when both needed saving. She prepared tea and sat by the window where the morning sun touched her hands. The warmth spread gently, and she felt it reach the deepest parts of her heart. It reminded her that love, once planted, keeps growing long after the hands that planted it have rested. She whispered a prayer of thanks for the day, for the land, for Jacob, and for the quiet strength that had guided her through every season. As the morning passed, she walked through the fields slowly, her steps measured but sure. The air smelled faintly of rain. The fences were strong, the barn repaired, and the soil ready for planting again. She felt the pulse of life beneath her feet, steady and patient. When she reached the far edge of the property, she stopped to rest by the old tree where the view stretched endlessly toward the horizon. She thought of all the mornings she had stood there, the early days of loneliness, the days of discovery, the nights of fear, and the years of peace that had followed. Each chapter felt like a verse in a long prayer. The clouds moved softly across the sky, casting shadows that drifted across the fields. Dorothy closed her eyes for a moment and listened. The wind, the rustle of grass, the faint hum of the world, all of it blended into something sacred. She remembered her husband's words, the ones he had once spoken long ago, that faith was not about waiting for miracles, but about recognizing them when they quietly appeared. She smiled, because she knew now how true that was. Later that afternoon, a small truck appeared on the road again. She watched it from the porch, her heart already recognizing the sound. Jacob stepped out, taller and older than before, carrying another package under his arm. Time had shaped him into a man, yet his smile carried the same warmth it always had. He greeted her with an embrace that spoke of years of love contained in one moment. He said he had come to bring something special, something he had been working on for months. When they sat together inside, he unwrapped the cloth, revealing a large wooden frame with a carved verse. The words read, "Grace lives where love chooses to stay." Around the edges were small carvings of the ranch, the barn, the porch, the open fields, and a small figure of a woman sitting by the window. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears as she traced the lines with her fingers. She told him it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Jacob said that the workshop was growing quickly and that he had hired 2 young men to help him. He said he often told them stories about the ranch, about how it had changed him, about the lessons he had learned there. He said he wanted every child who came to his workshop to know that their hands could create beauty, even if their hearts had once known pain. Dorothy listened, her chest full of pride. She told him that the greatest legacy anyone could leave was not in buildings or land, but in hearts that had learned to love again because of you. She said that his life was the proof of everything she had prayed for. They spent that evening walking through the property together, remembering the past. Jacob laughed when he saw the spot by the barn where he had once hidden. Dorothy told him that the sound of his small footsteps that night had been the first real sound of life the ranch had heard in years. He said that her prayers had been the first warmth he had ever known after fear. They both laughed softly, not out of sadness, but because the pain had turned into peace long ago. When the sun began to sink, they sat side by side on the porch. The sky turned gold, then rose, then deep orange before fading into blue. The wind carried the cool scent of evening, and the horizon glowed like the edge of heaven. Jacob said he would visit more often now that the workshop was running smoothly. Dorothy nodded, her heart steady. She said that he didn't need to promise. The road between them would always remain open. As darkness fell, the first stars appeared one by one. They sat in silence, watching the sky. Dorothy thought about how her life had begun in noise and struggle, then moved through years of loss and loneliness, only to end in stillness and grace. She understood that time had not taken from her. It had transformed her. Each loss had become a seed, and every act of love had become its bloom. When Jacob left the next morning, he hugged her tightly and said that everything he had done, every carving, every lesson, every act of kindness, carried her spirit in it. He told her that the world was better because she had chosen not to close her heart when it had every reason to. Dorothy held his face in her hands and told him to keep living with courage, to keep building, and to remember that grace would always find him wherever he went. After he drove away, she stood by the gate for a long while, watching until the road swallowed the sound of his truck. The land was quiet again, but not empty. The peace that filled it was alive, steady and eternal. She walked back toward the house slowly, her coat brushing against the tall grass. When she reached the porch, she looked back one more time at the sign on the gate. The name carved in wood still glowed softly under the morning light. She whispered a final prayer, not asking, not hoping, just thanking. Thanking for the years, for the pain that had turned to wisdom, for the love that had returned when she least expected it, and for the grace that had stayed long enough to change everything. Inside, the fire still burned softly. The carvings on the shelf caught the light again. The horse, the dove, the tree, the small house, and now the new frame with its carved words. Each piece told the same story in a different way. Together they spoke of faith, redemption, and endurance, the quiet truths that had guided her life. Dorothy sat in her chair by the window and watched the sun rise higher. The plains shimmered with light, and for a moment everything felt still, the kind of stillness that comes not from emptiness, but from fulfillment. She closed her eyes, her heart calm, her hands resting on the Bible that had followed her through every season. The wind passed softly across the house, through the open window, and across the land beyond. It carried the scent of grass and earth, and something timeless. The house, the fields, and the quiet soul who had given them life all breathed as one. Dorothy had come to the ranch, seeking peace. In the end, she had found something far greater. She had found purpose, she had found faith, and she had found proof that even the smallest act of love could echo across generations. And on that quiet morning at Grace Hill Ranch, the land stood still in golden light, a living witness that grace, once given, never leaves. It simply remains steady, unseen, eternal.